One of the questions we get from the public, and I do a lot of public presentations with the commodity groups, farm organizations, conservation groups, folks in the farm community, is how are scientists so confident that the climate is changing? And to break that down, to build the case, we really think about it as a series of questions. Are we confident in the roles that greenhouse gases play in the climate system? Do we know that those concentrations are changing, and can we tie those changes to human activity? As a consequence, is there evidence that the climate is changing, and are those changes consistent with the patterns that we'd expect given the changes that we're seeing in greenhouse gas concentration? And then finally, what's really important for agriculture, what are the implications of that, and what are the impacts, and are we seeing that on the ground when it comes to our field operations? So very quickly, and this is the 101 slide on climate change, the greenhouse effect. When you think about the greenhouse effect, it's critical to maintaining life on Earth. Basically, all of the energy, virtually all the energy we receive as a planet comes in the form of solar radiation. A fair amount of that is directly reflected back. And so you can think about radiation in two forms, one being solar radiation, which is light, the other being infrared radiation, which is heat. And so much of the energy that comes into the planet in the form of solar radiation is reflected back into space. Some of it is absorbed within the planet and then re-radiated in the form of infrared radiation or heat. So you can think about, on a sunny day, if you're in a park, you can feel warm rock. That is, in fact, infrared radiation, where the heat has been absorbed from the sun, is being radiated off back into the atmosphere. Now, within the atmosphere, it would not necessarily radiate right back into space, but in many cases, the greenhouse gases, and that includes a combination of gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, a number of synthetic gases, and water vapor, have properties which allow them to absorb infrared radiation, take on that energy, and then release it. And when the greenhouse gases release that energy, they release it in all directions. And some of that energy gets radiated back down to the surface. And that really is the blanket property that we think about when we think about the role that greenhouse gases play. And so as the concentration of those greenhouse gases grows, that blanket effect increases, and what we would expect to see is some warming. So are those concentrations changing? And this graph here is probably the most commonly cited and most important graph in the whole field of climate change. It's the data on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere going back to the late 1950s. This data is collected at the top of a volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the state of Hawaii. And the reason why that data is important is because that data is not influenced by a lot of human activity. The data that we're getting at the top of Mauna Loa is really the good background data on CO2 concentrations. And what is really interesting about this slide is two things. One, certainly there's an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. If you go back to pre-industrial times, we were about 290 parts per million. We're now, after the year 2015, we're now up over 400, just right about 400 at this point. So certainly CO2 concentrations are increasing. The second point is that that line is not a straight line, but it's serrated. You can see the spikes and the troughs in the line, and they reflect the role that the terrasphere, that vegetation plays in the greenhouse gas cycle and the carbon cycle. And what's being reflected there is carbon that's being absorbed in terrestrial vegetation and then being released during the winters in the northern hemisphere. And the reason why there are those differences is because there's a lot more land in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So in the northern summer, we see a lot more sequestration or storage of carbon in the vegetation, and in the winter, that carbon is released. So a lot of interesting things going along in this slide. So we know that the greenhouse gases play a role in climate change. We know that CO2 concentrations, and in fact, we know that the other concentrations of greenhouse gases are rising as well. Can we detect changes? And in fact, the data that most folks look at is this data on air temperatures. Are we seeing changes in air temperatures near the surface? Well, that's only one of the parameters that turns out to be relevant. In fact, we see changes in almost every single important climate variable that is important for long-term information. So sea ice, sea surface temperatures, ocean heat content, sea level, the temperature over land, glaciers, and snow cover. All of these indicators of change, in fact, are changing. And this next slide shows the data that we've been collecting on all of these 10 indicators of climate change. And you can see that over the last century, century and a half, there have been increases in surface temperatures, increases in sea temperatures, increases in ocean heat content, decreases in Arctic sea ice extent, decreases and increasing decreases in the mass of glaciers, and slowly we're seeing sea level rise as well. So many of the indicators that we would expect to see changing with changing CO2 concentrations, in fact, are occurring. This shows that while we look at the average over the last century, that average is really the number around 1940 or 1950. If you go back to the late 1800s, we've seen a progression of change that's been consistent and is slightly growing, a change of about 0.2 degrees of warming per decade, which is slowly increasing now. We're seeing a little bit more than 0.2 degrees of warming per decade, and in fact, over the last 4 decades, we've seen average warming in each of those decades. So we're at the point where, virtually every year we're seeing over the last decade has been warmer than the decade before. One of the interesting things that we've done is looked back and tried to actually replicate the data. And so if you look at this black line, that is the actual temperature change that we've seen over the last century. Now, we have a series of complicated models, global circulation models, that can estimate what climate should be and what average temperatures should be. And we can run them backward in time and taking out the effect of greenhouse gases. And in fact, this blue range is what you get when you run the CGMs backward over the last century, not accounting for the effects of greenhouse gases. And then when you add the effects of greenhouse gases, you get the results from these models that's illustrated in the red. And you can see that the only way that we can actually replicate the actual temperature patterns that we've seen over the last year using these models is by accounting for the radiative forcing that we get from greenhouse gases. And so, it's all of this evidence, the data we're seeing on CO2 concentrations, the data we're collecting in the field on the climate system itself, the modeling, the physics. All of this is telling us a picture of the fact that the climate is changing and that humans are really, in terms of a driver, the force behind the anthropogenic component of the changes we're seeing. So now some parameters that are really important for agriculture. I talked about average temperature changes, and in fact, you can see that over most of the country, but not all of the country. There's this portion of the South Central that we really have not seen a great amount of warming. What's also interesting is that we've seen more warming in the winter than in the summer, and the cooling trend that is much more pronounced in the summer is centered over the Midwest and Great Plains region. And the theory is that it's actually agriculture, that what we're seeing here is a lot of evapotranspiration from crop cultivation and a significant amount of water being pumped up into the atmosphere from crops in the Midwest during the summer months that's causing some cooling over that region of the country. And that's part of the reason why we're not seeing the extensive warming over the entire continental U.S. We have this sort of island or bubble of temperature changes in the summer months in particular that we see over the Midwest. We're also seeing changes in the climate system, so changes in precipitation, and those changes are not uniform across the country. We're seeing a drying in the Southwest in particular, wetter conditions in the Midwest and in the Northeast. And again, across seasons, that's not consistent. A lot of the moisture increases we're seeing in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, and in the Great Plains are happening in the spring. That's important for farmers that are interested in making sure they have proper conditions to get their crops in. We're also seeing a lot of precipitation increases in the fall as well, and more drying in the summer months, which can contribute to seasonal drought. The precipitation changes we're seeing are not uniform. In fact, we're seeing an increase in very heavy precipitation events, and that is also consistent with what we'd expect with climate change. When we're pumping more energy into the climate system, you're going to see more events that are considered to be extreme events. And in fact, not only are we seeing greater precipitation, we're seeing a greater percentage of that precipitation falling in these extreme events. One of the things that's been beneficial to farmers in many regions of the country is an increase in the frost-free season and the growing season, and that's particularly true in the western states, but it's important from an agricultural perspective in the northern plains and in the Corn Belt, where we've seen a week to 14 days of warming on average since the 1950s. And are farmers responding? And I think, generally, I think you can say yes, and they're responding in a number of ways. Here we're seeing an increase in corn acreage by county. Now, you would expect to see increases in corn over this period given increases in demand, but where we're seeing the increases was really in the northern plains and in the Dakotas, regions of the country that weren't really part of the main place of corn production over a decade ago. Some of that is due to shorter season corn that's been available, but some of it is also due to the fact that we have a longer growing season and we're able to get crops in the Dakotas when it comes to corn. That corn is replacing wheat, and so over that same time period, we're seeing a shift in where wheat is being grown through the U.S. And so that, those data are important in terms of looking at how farmers are responding. One other thing that is pretty clear in the data is that farmers are also responding to these wet springs by getting their crop in quicker. There's this anecdotal data that the entire state of Iowa can be planted in 7 days. So the size of equipment that farmers are purchasing and their ability to get the crop into the field more quickly is really in response, at least in part, to the fact that we're seeing wetter springs and shorter planting windows. So wetter springs is part of the story. Drought is another part of the story, and the 2011 drought is a great example of sort of the interplay between climate forces and climate variability. And NOAA has determined, looking at that drought, that the signature of it has a climate footprint, that human-induced climate change, at least in part, was a driver behind the really extensive drought we saw in the Southwest in 2011, followed by an area where the drought expanded to most of the country, especially the large parts of the Midwest in 2012. And farmers respond to drought as well. And in fact, if you look at cattle and calves and the cattle inventory during that period, there was a pretty significant shift and really a liquidation of a lot of the cattle herd in the lower southern Great Plains, and an increase in cattle production in some other regions of the country. Now, what we might expect is after that, and we'll have the new Ag Census data out, is that following that drought and following these reductions in inventory, we're probably going to see an increase back again. And so these changes, while they were driven by the drought, may not be permanent.